Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we drift back to the cold, still waters of the North Atlantic, where survivors of the Titanic carried their stories quietly into the rest of their lives. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you. Feel the weight of your limbs, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the way the air moves quietly in and out without any effort from you at all. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing at the edge of a very still harbor. The year is 1912. The air around you carries the faint smell of coal smoke and sea salt, of fresh paint and rope and polished brass. The sky above is enormous and soft, the kind of sky that holds its color long after the sun has gone, a deep indigo fading into black at the edges, pricked through with the first cold stars of evening. The water before you is dark and glassy, barely moving. A long pier stretches out over it, and at the end of that pier, lit from within like a city that has learned to float, sits the largest ship the world has ever known. She is magnificent. She is quiet in the way that only very large things can be quiet, a silence that comes not from emptiness, but from a kind of immensity that has no need to announce itself. Tonight, we are going to spend time with the people who were aboard her. We are going to move gently through their stories, through their courage and their grief, through the long dark hours they spent on the open ocean and the long lives they carried afterward. These are not stories of disaster, though disaster is part of them. These are stories of survival. Of the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to go on. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts become gentle. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. We begin. Part 1, The Ship That Was Called Unsinkable. To understand what it meant to survive the Titanic, you must first understand what the Titanic was, not just as an object, a vessel, a collection of steel and iron and oak and crystal, but as an idea. As a belief. As something that the early 20th century had decided to make real. The ship was built in Belfast, in the yards of Harland and Wolff, on the banks of the River Lagan. Construction began in March of 1909. For the next 3 years, the ship grew in the air above the slipway like something impossibly large being slowly revealed, a cathedral being assembled piece by piece out of iron and fire, and the labor of thousands of men who came to work each morning and spent their days in the noise and heat of the shipyard, riveting and welding, climbing and hammering, hauling and fitting. At the height of construction, more than 3,000 men were working on her at any given time. They came from the terraced streets of Belfast, from the counties of Antrim and Down, from small towns where their fathers and grandfathers had worked the same yards before them. Some of them were boys, barely teenagers, whose first job was to carry red-hot rivets in a small metal bucket from the furnace to the riveters waiting high up on the scaffolding. They would toss the rivets through the air, a glowing arc of orange metal in the grey Belfast light, and the riveter would catch it in a leather cup and drive it home with a hammer while it was still hot enough to shape. It was brutal work, and beautiful in its way. The sound of 1,000 hammers at once, a sound like the world itself being forged. The ship that emerged from this labor was beyond anything that had existed before her. She was 882 feet long. She was nearly 92 feet wide. From the bottom of her keel to the top of her funnels, she rose as tall as an 11-story building. She displaced more than 52,000 tons of water when fully loaded. And she was not merely large. She was lavish. She was the product of a company, the White Star Line, that had decided the way to compete with its rivals was not through speed, but through luxury. Through comfort so extreme, so carefully calibrated, that the very wealthiest passengers in the world would feel not that they were crossing an ocean, but that they were residing temporarily in a floating palace of astonishing refinement. The first-class dining saloon could seat more than 500 passengers at a time. It spanned the full width of the ship, its walls paneled in white oak in the Jacobean style, its tables set with White Star silver and crystal and fine bone china. There was a Parisian café, modeled on the sidewalk cafés of the French capital, where passengers could sit beneath wrought iron trellises and sip coffee and watch the sea. There was a swimming bath, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium fitted with mechanical horses and a rowing machine and an electric camel, a device no one on record ever seems to have used to any great effect. There were squash courts and a barbershop and a darkroom where amateur photographers could develop their films. There was a first-class reading and writing room paneled in Georgian white, so quiet and hushed that passengers wrote letters home describing it as the most peaceful room they had ever sat in. There was a smoking room for gentlemen, its walls inlaid with mother of pearl, a fire burning in the hearth, the air faintly blue with the smell of cigars and good whiskey. But it was not only the rich who sailed on her. Below the glittering corridors of first class, below the respectable and comfortable cabins of second class, the ship carried more than 700 passengers in third class, the emigrants. Men and women and children who had paid everything they had, or nearly everything, for a berth in the lower decks, for a passage across the Atlantic to a new life in America. The Titanic left Southampton on the 10th of April, 1912, on a mild and sunny spring morning. She stopped at Cherbourg in France, and at Queenstown, now Cove in Ireland, to take on additional passengers and mail. And then she turned her great bow westward, toward New York, toward the dream that so many of her passengers had been carrying with them for so long. She carried 2,224 souls. She carried, in her cargo holds, a shipment of 76 cases of dragon's blood, a red resin used in making varnish. She carried a large consignment of tennis balls. She carried an antique automobile, crated and braced against the roll of the sea. She carried letters and packages and parcels destined for addresses all across America. She carried the luggage of the wealthy, trunks lined with silk and smelling faintly of cedar. She also carried, in a sealed envelope in the ship's safe, something more important than any of those things. She carried the stories of everyone on board. Stories not yet finished. Lives not yet resolved. Dreams not yet arrived at. It is those stories we are here for tonight. The first 4 days of the voyage were, by most accounts, extraordinarily pleasant. The North Atlantic in mid-April can be treacherous, gray and cold and rough, but in that first week of the month, the sea was unusually calm. Passengers remarked on it in their letters and diaries. They said the ocean was like glass. They said they could forget they were moving at all. And then the night of the 14th of April arrived. Part 2, the night of the 14th. By the evening of Sunday, the 14th of April, the Titanic was making good time across the North Atlantic. She had been receiving wireless messages throughout the day, messages from other ships ahead of her, warning of ice. Ice in unusual quantities. Ice reported far further south than was normal for the season. The captain, Edward John Smith, was a man of 62 years. He was large and white-bearded and carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades at sea. He had been at sea since he was 13 years old. He had commanded more ships than most men dream of. The Titanic was to be his final voyage. He had planned to retire after delivering her safely to New York. He had said as much to his wife, Eleanor, and to his daughter, Helen, before leaving Southampton. He had received the ice warnings. He had read them. He had, after some consideration, maintained the ship's speed approximately 22 knots, close to her maximum, and pressed on. This was not, by the standards of the time, an unusual decision. Ice warnings were common on the North Atlantic route. Ships encountered ice regularly. It was generally believed that a sharp lookout was sufficient precaution, that a ship of this size and quality would have ample time to alter course if any ice was sighted. The ocean was calm. The night was clear. Visibility was excellent. What the officers on the Titanic did not fully account for, what perhaps no one on that ship fully understood that night, was the nature of the ice they were approaching. Not scattered field ice, the kind easily spotted and steered around, but a concentration of large icebergs, massive and dark, rising from a sea so still that there were no waves to break white at their bases, no visual cue that might catch the eye of a man on watch. The night was bitterly cold. The air temperature had dropped well below freezing. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water, kept liquid only by its salt content. High in the crow's nest, 60 feet above the ship's forward deck, 2 lookouts stood watch. Their names were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They had been up there since 10 o'clock, and the cold had settled into their bones in the particular way that cold does at height, with nothing to break the wind. They had binoculars, or rather, they should have had binoculars, but the binoculars that were supposed to be in the crow's nest were missing. They had been left behind in Southampton, or misplaced during the ship's previous voyage, depending on who you believe. And so Fleet and Lee stood in the dark and the cold and watched with their naked eyes, scanning the black water ahead. At 23 minutes and 40 seconds past 11 o'clock, Frederick Fleet saw something. It was dark. It was large. It was directly ahead. He rang the crow's nest bell 3 times, the signal for an object dead ahead, and grabbed the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg," he said, when the phone was answered. "Right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch ordered the helm hard to starboard and the engines reversed. The ship began as slowly, because a ship of this size cannot turn quickly, to swing to the left. For a moment, it seemed it might be enough. The bow was swinging. The iceberg was growing larger, filling the darkness ahead, a dark mass of ice against the dark sky. Then the bird passed along the ship's starboard side. It seemed, to those who watched from the deck, that it had missed. Some passengers who were still awake came out of their cabins at the slight shudder they had felt, saw the ice sliding past in the dark, laughed, picked up pieces of ice from the deck where small chunks had fallen, and went back to their card games. But below the waterline, where the hull of the ship slid past the underwater shelf of the berg, something different had happened. The ice had opened the ship's side in a series of small fractures, not one great gash as was once believed, but multiple small openings across 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. The ship had been designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. 5 would sink her. 6 was catastrophic. The water began to come in. At first, only those in the very lowest decks knew. The men working in the boiler rooms at the front of the ship heard the sound, a deep, grinding groan from somewhere below them, and then the water came rushing in. Some of them escaped by climbing the ladders to the deck above. Some did not. In the mailroom, 4 postal clerks noticed almost at once that the water was rising through the floor. They spent the next 20 minutes trying to carry mail bags up to a higher deck, 200 and some bags of mail, wet and heavy, handed up through a hatch in a human chain. They saved as many as they could before they had to stop. None of the 4 postal clerks survived the night. Up on the passenger decks, things were quieter. There was no alarm. No announcement. No organized effort to wake the passengers and move them to the lifeboats. For the first hour or so after the collision, the vast majority of the people on the Titanic had no clear idea that anything was seriously wrong. Some were awakened by the shudder of the impact, or by the strange silence when the engines stopped, for the engines stopped almost immediately after the collision, and a ship that has been vibrating constantly since the moment it left port, that has surrounded its passengers with a constant deep mechanical hum, becomes very noticeable when it suddenly goes quiet. Others slept straight through it. The officers of the ship gathered on the bridge. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, a quiet, serious Irishman from Comer, in County Down, who knew the ship more intimately than anyone alive, was called to conduct an inspection of the damage. He moved quickly through the lower decks with a lamp and a sounding rod, and within half an hour he returned to the bridge with his assessment. The ship would sink, he said, in approximately 1 hour, perhaps 1.5 hours. 2 hours at the most. Captain Smith received this information in silence. He was a man who had spent 40 years at sea without serious incident. He now stood in the middle of the greatest disaster of his career, perhaps of his century, with perhaps 20 minutes already gone. He gave the order to uncover the lifeboats. Part 3, the boats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. She carried 14 standard wooden lifeboats, 2 emergency cutters, and 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides. This was, by the maritime regulations of 1912, more than the law required for a ship of her size. The British Board of Trade's regulations for the number of lifeboats required on a vessel were based on tonnage, and had not been updated since 1894, since before ships of this scale had been imagined. The regulations were simply out of date. The 20 lifeboats had a combined capacity of approximately 1,178 people. The ship was carrying 2,224. In the best possible scenario, with every lifeboat filled to capacity, more than 1,000 people would be left without a place in a boat. The lifeboats were not filled to capacity. The first lifeboat launched from the Titanic, Lifeboat 7, had a capacity of 65. It left the ship with 28 people in it. The second boat launched, Lifeboat 5, left with 41. The third, Lifeboat 3, with 32. There were reasons for this, reasons that feel inadequate now, but which were shaped by the particular blindness of that particular night. The crew had not been drilled in lifeboat loading procedures. The officers were improvising under pressure, without clear orders about how many people to put in each boat, without certainty that the davits could support a fully loaded lifeboat during lowering. There was a widespread belief, even among the crew, that the situation could not truly be as serious as the order to uncover the boats implied. And there was the cold. The deck of the Titanic was bitterly, penetratingly cold that night. Passengers who came up to investigate, who stood in their nightclothes or their hastily thrown-on coats and looked at the dark ocean far below, at the small wooden lifeboat hanging there in the lamplight, at the immense black sea waiting beneath it, many of them turned back. They went back to their cabins. They sat in the warmth and told themselves and each other that the ship could not really be sinking, that it was too large, too new, too magnificently engineered, that they would be safer here, inside, than out there on the freezing ocean in a small wooden boat. And for the first hour, it was genuinely hard to argue with that reasoning. The ship felt solid. It felt stable. The lights were on. The musicians in the first-class lounge had begun to play ragtime, light and cheerful, the sound floating up through the ship in the cold air. The musicians. 8 men. They played that night, most accounts say, until the very end. Their names were Wallace Hartley, who led them, and John Hume, and John Clark, and John Woodward, and Fred Clark, and Percy Taylor, and George Crins, and Roger Bricoux. Hartley was from Colne, in Lancashire, the son of a choirmaster, a young man who had been engaged to be married. Bricoux was French, barely 20 years old. Hume was from Dumfries, in Scotland, 21 years old. Their average age was perhaps 25. They played as the ship settled lower in the water. They played as the bow went under. They stood on the slanting deck and they played, and people who were near them as they scrambled for the remaining boats later said that the music was the strangest and most human sound they had ever heard, the sound of people choosing beauty over panic, even then. None of the musicians survived. The loading of the lifeboats continued for approximately 2 hours. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in charge, and he interpreted his orders strictly. Women and children first meant women and children only, at least for the first several boats. Men who tried to board were turned back. Families were separated in the cold and the dark, husbands watching their wives and children descend into the night, not knowing if they would ever see them again. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was somewhat more flexible. He allowed men to board if there were no women in the immediate vicinity. The result was that some starboard boats left with men aboard, while some portside boats left with empty seats. In the boats themselves, as they were lowered a distance of roughly 60 feet from the ship's rail to the water, the terror was very particular. The boats swung and bumped against the side of the ship. The ropes that held them were operated by people under great stress, and sometimes one end descended faster than the other, tilting the boat alarmingly. People in the boats gripped the sides and each other, their breath coming in clouds of vapor in the frozen air, the enormous lit flanks of the ship moving past them as they went down, the sound of the band still faintly audible above. And then the boat reached the water. The ropes were released. Oars were found and fitted and rowed, often by passengers who had no idea how to row, because many of the crew assigned to the boats were stokers or stewards who had never operated a lifeboat either. And the boat moved away from the ship. And then the people in the boats turned and looked back. The Titanic was lit from stem to stern. Every light blazing. And she was tilting. The bow was lower than the stern now, visibly, unmistakably. Her lights reflected in the black still water below her. The band was playing. Steam was still venting from her funnels in great white clouds that caught the starlight. She was the most beautiful thing those people had ever seen, and she was dying. Part 4: Those Who Waited in the Dark. In the boats, the cold was extraordinary. The air temperature that night was roughly 23 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 10 degrees below freezing. The ocean temperature, as already noted, was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. People in the lifeboats had left the ship in a hurry, or had been brought up from their beds, and many of them were dressed inadequately for the cold. Women in nightgowns with evening coats thrown over them. Children wrapped in blankets. Men in dinner jackets, or in the clothes they had hastily pulled on when the shudder of the impact had woken them. The boats were not equipped with food or water. They had no lights of their own. They sat in the dark on the still black ocean, a vast silence around them, and waited. Her father, Benjamin, helped load the boats. He handed his wife and daughter into lifeboat 14 and stayed behind. He was never seen again. Eva Hart, sitting in that boat in the dark, later remembered the sounds. Not the band, which had gone quiet by then. Not the creaking of the oars. What she remembered most, and spoke of most often, was the sound that came after the ship went down. The sound of the people in the water. We will come to that. But for now, let us stay in the boats. Lifeboat 1 held 12 people when it left the Titanic. It had a capacity of 40. Among those 12 was a man named Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, a Scottish baronet, and his wife Lucy, who was a famous fashion designer. She ran a couture house under the name Madame Lucille. They were traveling with Lucy's secretary, a woman named Laura Mabel Francatelli. After the Titanic sank, Cosmo Duff-Gordon allegedly gave each of the crewmen in the boat a £5 note, a significant sum at the time, and the boat did not return to pick up survivors from the water. This would become one of the most controversial stories of the entire disaster, debated in newspapers and at the official inquiries for years afterward. Sir Cosmo said the money was compensation for the kit the crewmen had lost when the ship went down. His critics said it was a bribe to keep the boat away from the screaming men and women in the water, whose weight might have swamped the underfilled boat. The truth is probably somewhere in the painful middle. The crewmen in Boat 1 were afraid. The water was full of dying people. They believed, perhaps not entirely incorrectly, that a mob of desperate drowning people might capsize a small wooden lifeboat. They were cold and frightened and in a situation no training had prepared them for, and they made a choice. A choice that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was one of the few officers who did go back. He had been in charge of Lifeboat 14, and after the ship sank, he transferred his passengers to other boats, gathered a crew of volunteers, and returned to the area where the Titanic had gone down. He found more than 1,000 people in the water. He was too late for most of them. By the time he reached them, the water had done what water at that temperature does. Hypothermia at 28 degrees Fahrenheit comes very quickly. In those conditions, a person can lose consciousness within 15 to 30 minutes, depending on their body type, their clothing, their physical condition. Many of the people in the water had already gone quiet. Some had already died. Lowe and his crew pulled 4 people alive from the water. One of them died later on the Carpathia. A handful of others were found alive by other boats, or managed to cling to the overturned collapsible B. The cold of the North Atlantic that night killed more than 600 people who might otherwise have been saved, had there been boats enough, had the boats gone back sooner, had the rescue ship arrived in time. But rescue was coming. 60 miles away, the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner, smaller and slower than the Titanic, carrying primarily passengers from the Mediterranean, had received the distress call. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, had immediately turned his ship and driven her at maximum speed through ice-filled waters he had no detailed chart of, pushing her engines harder than they had ever been pushed, posting extra lookouts, ordering every pot and kettle in the ship's kitchen to be boiling to provide hot drinks for the survivors he was going to find. He reached the boats at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. The Titanic had gone down at approximately 2:20 in the morning. The people in the lifeboats had been on the ocean, in the cold and the dark, for something between 1 and 4 hours, depending on when their boat had been launched. What the crew of the Carpathia saw as they approached in the gray pre-dawn light was something that stayed with them forever. Small dark shapes on an impossibly still ocean, scattered across a wide area, each one holding its small cargo of cold and traumatized survivors. Beyond the boats, floating in the water, the wreckage of the ship, deck chairs and life vests and debris of every kind. And ice. Great white icebergs in every direction, silent and enormous in the early morning light, the same ice that had killed the ship now glittering with a terrible beauty in the first pale blue of dawn. Captain Rostron stood on the bridge of the Carpathia and watched his men bring the survivors aboard, one by one, many of them too cold and too stiff to climb the ladder and having to be hauled up in slings, or sitting in a rope chair with a child in their lap, rising slowly up the side of the ship in the growing light. He later said it was the most extraordinary and terrible morning of his life. Part 5, The Survivors, First Class. Of the roughly 325 people traveling in first class on the Titanic, approximately 200 survived. The survival rate for first class was notably higher than for second class, and dramatically higher than for third class, and this disparity would become one of the most debated and painful aspects of the disaster. The reasons were multiple. First-class cabins were on higher decks, closer to the boat deck where the lifeboats were launched. First-class passengers had stewards who came to their cabins and knocked on their doors and guided them to the boats. They knew the layout of the ship. They had, simply, a shorter distance to travel and better guidance to get there. Among those who survived in first class were some of the most famous names of the era. Margaret Brown, known to later generations as the unsinkable Molly Brown, a nickname she never used during her own lifetime, was a woman of considerable fortune from Denver, Colorado. She was 51 years old, broad-shouldered and practical, the daughter of Irish immigrants, a woman who had made her own way in the world long before her husband struck gold in the Little Johnny mine. She had been in Europe on a trip and had boarded the Titanic at Cherbourg. When the ship began to sink, she helped load other women and children into the boats, and had to be, by her own account, more or less physically placed in Boat 6 herself by other passengers who knew she was still on deck. In Boat 6, she found herself in a lifeboat rowed almost entirely by crew members who were becoming exhausted in the bitter cold. She took an oar herself and rowed. She organized the other women in the boat to take turns rowing to stay warm. When the quartermaster in charge of the boat suggested they should stay away from the area where survivors were in the water, fearing the boat would be swamped, she confronted him directly, loudly, and with considerable force of personality. He held his position. She never forgave him. Margaret Brown went on to become one of the most visible and vocal advocates for the survivors. She helped organize relief funds on the Carpathia itself, moving through the ship collecting money from the rescued first-class passengers for the survivors who had nothing, the women from steerage who had reached the Carpathia with only the clothes they were wearing. She helped establish the Titanic Survivors Committee. She fought for the rights of the crew members who survived and found themselves without employment or financial support. She remained angry about the Titanic, and specifically about the failures of organization and preparation that had caused so many deaths, for the rest of her life. She died in 1932, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of people who had never been on any ship, who knew her only because she had been there, and had fought, and had refused to be quieted about what she had seen. Another first-class survivor was Arthur Pearchin, a major in the Canadian militia and a competent yachtsman. When Second Officer Lightoller needed a man who could actually handle a small boat, Pearchin volunteered, shinned down a rope from the Titanic's deck to Lifeboat 6 below, a considerable feat at 50 years old in formal dress, and spent the rest of the night rowing. He survived, but his survival haunted him. He had been a wealthy man, a prominent man in Toronto society. After the Titanic, he found that the mere fact of being a male survivor brought a cloud of suspicion over him. People, the newspapers, the public, other men who had not been there, seemed to feel that a man who had survived when so many other men had died must somehow have transgressed, must have taken a place in a boat that should have gone to someone else. He struggled with this for the rest of his life. His business declined. He died in 1929, having never fully recovered his standing or his peace of mind. This shadow, this sense of guilt or transgression or simple inadequacy in the face of what had happened, was something that followed many of the male survivors, in first class and everywhere else, for years. One of the most remarkable first-class survivors was a young woman named Edith Russell, or Edith Rosenbaum, as she was born, having changed her name to Russell for her work as a fashion correspondent. She was covering the Paris fashion season for an American trade newspaper and had boarded the Titanic at Cherbourg with 13 trunks of sample gowns. She had won a judgment against the White Star Line earlier and had needed to be persuaded to board the ship at all, having initially refused on a premonition of disaster. Her friends had laughed at her. They had teased her about her superstition. When the ship began to sink, Edith refused at first to get into a lifeboat. She went back to her cabin. She retrieved a musical toy pig that her mother had given her, a small stuffed pig that played the mashish when its tail was wound up. She wound up the pig's tail and held it as she finally allowed herself to be placed in a boat. She later said that the sound of that small mechanical music, tinny and absurd in the cold and dark, had kept her calm. Had given her something to hold on to when the alternative was despair. Edith Russell lived to be 98 years old. She kept the toy pig her entire life. It is now in a museum. Part 6, The Survivors, Second Class. Of the approximately 285 people traveling in second class on the Titanic, approximately 119 survived. The survival rate for second class, roughly 40%, was lower than first class, higher than third class, and devastatingly skewed by gender. Of the 168 men traveling in second class, only 14 survived. Of the women and children, nearly all survived. This disparity tells its own story. The loading of the lifeboats on the port side, under Lightollers' strict interpretation of women and children first, meant that many second-class men who came to the boat deck found no place available to them. Some of them helped load other passengers and then stood back. Some of them went below again. Some of them simply waited, in the cold and the tilt of the dying ship, for whatever was coming. Among those who survived from second class was Lawrence Beasley, an Englishman, a science teacher from Dulwich College. He was 29 years old, on his way to visit relatives in Canada, a mild and observant man who had spent much of the voyage reading in his cabin. He survived in Lifeboat 13, and within a year of the disaster, he had written a book about it, The Loss of the SS Titanic, that remains one of the most precise and thoughtful first-person accounts of the disaster ever written. Beasley was a scientist, and he wrote about the Titanic the way a scientist writes about an observed phenomenon, carefully, honestly, with specific attention to what he had actually experienced, rather than what he thought people might want to hear. He described the absolute silence on the ship in the first hour after the collision, the lack of any alarm, the way people had drifted in small groups through the corridors looking at each other for information that no one had. He described the sound of the ship breaking apart in the distance as he sat in the lifeboat, a sound he compared to the tearing of a very large piece of calico. He described coming up the side of the Carpathia in a rope chair in the grey morning light, and the faces of the Carpathia's passengers looking down at him as he rose, faces full of shock and sympathy and something he had trouble naming, something that was not quite pity and not quite relief, something more like the expression on the face of someone who has witnessed something they know they will never forget. Lawrence Beasley lived until 1967. He was 89 years old when he died. The Titanic, he later said, never left him. It appeared in his dreams. Not as nightmare, necessarily, though sometimes it was that, but simply as presence. As a place he had been, a night he had lived through, a fact about himself that he could not put down. One of the most moving stories among the second-class survivors belongs to a woman named Charlotte Collier. She was 30 years old, a farmer's daughter from Hampshire, traveling with her husband Harvey and their 8-year-old daughter Marjorie to start a new life in the farming country of Idaho. They had sold everything, their home, Harvey's ironmonger's shop, and Harvey had put the money in his pocket in cash, a significant sum, their entire savings, the total capital of their future. Charlotte and Marjorie were put into Lifeboat 14. Harvey was not allowed to board. Charlotte begged the officers to let him come. She was refused. The boat was lowered. Harvey Collier stood at the rail and watched the boat go down. He called something to his wife and daughter. Accounts differ on exactly what he said. Some say he called goodbye. Some say he called something else, something more private, something meant only for them. Charlotte later said she could not hear him clearly because of the noise of the steam venting from the funnels. She could see his face. She could see him standing at the rail. And then the boat reached the water, and the ship was too far above her, and she could see him no longer. Harvey Collier died that night. His body was never recovered. His savings, the cash in his pocket, the sum of everything he had built, went to the bottom of the North Atlantic with him. Charlotte and Marjorie arrived in New York with nothing except the clothes they were wearing. They had no money. They had no home to return to. They had no Harvey. Charlotte gave interviews to the newspapers in the days after the disaster. She spoke about Harvey directly and without sentimentality. She was not a woman who hid behind indirection, and what she said was simple. She said he was a good man. She said she did not understand why he was gone, and she was not. She said Marjorie kept asking for him, and she did not know what to tell her. She returned to England eventually. She died in 1914, 2 years after the Titanic, from tuberculosis, a disease she had probably been carrying when she boarded the ship, one of the reasons the family had decided to go to the clean air of Idaho. She was 32 years old. Marjorie grew up. She married. She had children. She rarely spoke about the Titanic. Part 7, The Survivors, Third Class. Of the approximately 709 people traveling in third class on the Titanic, approximately 174 survived. This is a survival rate of roughly 24%. Compared to the survival rate for first class, approximately 62%, the difference is stark, and it became, and remains, one of the most debated aspects of the disaster. To understand why the survival rate in third class was so much lower, you need to understand the physical layout of the ship. Third-class passengers were housed in the lower decks, at both the bow and the stern. Their quarters were separated from the upper decks and from the lifeboats by multiple layers of ship, corridors that led in the wrong direction, staircases that ended at locked gates, spaces that third-class passengers were not, in the ordinary course of a voyage, permitted to enter. When the ship began to sink, third-class passengers faced several challenges that their counterparts in first and second class did not. They were farther from the boat deck. They were less familiar with the layout of the ship. They had fewer stewards to guide them, and the stewards who did serve third class were not always present or directed to help them efficiently. And in some documented cases, gates between sections of the ship were not opened immediately, or not opened at all, leaving third-class passengers unable to reach the upper decks in time. This has led, in the century since the disaster, to a persistent narrative that third-class passengers were deliberately kept below decks, held back by locked gates and callous officers while the wealthy above them took the lifeboats. The truth, as with most complex human failures, is both more complicated and in some ways more damning. The ship had been designed to keep classes separate. The gates were not there to kill anyone in an emergency. They were there, in normal circumstances, to keep third-class passengers from wandering into second or first-class areas, which would have been considered a breach of propriety and, in the regulatory framework of the time, potentially a breach of customs regulations regarding immigrant passengers. The disaster did not create the inequality. It simply revealed it, in the starkest possible light, at the worst possible moment. Among those who survived from third class was Olas Abelseth, a Norwegian farmer, 26 years old, traveling with relatives to a farm in South Dakota. He was a large, strong young man, and he survived by waiting on the stern of the ship until the water came to him, and then swimming in the freezing ocean until he reached the overturned collapsible B and hung on. He was one of a small number of men who survived by clinging to or climbing aboard the overturned collapsible B. The boat had washed off the ship as she sank and floated upside down, its canvas sides compressed. Over the course of the night, between 30 and 35 men managed to get onto it, standing and lying on the upturned hull, balanced in the icy water, trying to keep the fragile craft from sinking under their combined weight. On top of collapsible B, through the long hours of the night, a man led prayers. His name was Harold Bride, and he was the Titanic's junior wireless operator. He had stayed at his post sending distress calls until the water came into the wireless room, and he had been washed off the stern of the ship as she went down. He had a badly frostbitten foot and considerable injuries, and he prayed, and the men around him prayed with him, and they balanced on the upturned hull and tried not to move too much, and waited for the light to come. Second Officer Lightoller was also on collapsible B. He was the most senior surviving officer, and in the morning, as the Carpathia approached, he took charge of the group on the hull, organizing them to lean to one side and then the other to keep the boat balanced as the waves from passing vessels shifted the water around them. When the Carpathia arrived, Lightoller was the last man to leave collapsible B. Among the third-class survivors was also a small number of children, separated from their parents in the chaos, placed in boats by strangers, carried by crew members who had no idea whose child they were holding. The story of these children, some of whom were eventually reunited with surviving parents, some of whom were not, is among the most quietly devastating of all the Titanic stories. There were two boys, Michel and Edmund Navratil, ages 3 and 2, who were found in lifeboat D by the Carpathia's crew. They could not say their names clearly. They could not say what had happened to their parents. They were French-speaking children, and the English-speaking crew of the Carpathia could not understand them. They were not orphans, exactly. Their mother was alive. She had not been on the ship. Their father, Michel Navratil Sr., had taken the boys secretly from their mother, from whom he was separated, intending to begin a new life with them in America. He had boarded the Titanic under the false name Louis Hoffman. He placed his sons in a lifeboat. He did not survive. the boys were photographed on the Carpathia. Their photograph was published in newspapers across Europe and America, captioned simply as "The Unknown Children of the Titanic." Their mother, Marcelle, saw the photograph in a French newspaper. She recognized her sons. She traveled to America and retrieved them. Michel Navratil Jr. lived until 2001. He was the last surviving male passenger from the Titanic. He spent his life as a professor of philosophy in France, and in his old age he spoke occasionally about what he remembered of that night. He remembered almost nothing concrete. He was 3 years old. He remembered sensations. He remembered warmth and cold and the smell of his father. Part 8: The Wireless and the Rescue. John George Phillips was 25 years old, a tall, capable man from Godalming in Surrey, the chief wireless operator on the Titanic. He had been at his post since early that evening, clearing a backlog of personal messages from first-class passengers, greetings, telegrams, the social correspondence of the wealthy that had accumulated over the day. He was tired. He had been on duty for many hours. Harold Bride was 22, his junior, from Bromley in Kent. They shared the wireless room in shifts. When the order came from Captain Smith to begin sending the distress signal at approximately 12:15 in the morning, Phillips was already at the key. He began transmitting the standard maritime distress call, CQD, followed by the ship's call sign and her position. CQD meaning, roughly, all stations, distress, was the standard distress signal of the era. The new International Distress Signal, SOS, had been adopted in 1906, but CQD was still widely used. That night, Phillips sent both, alternating between them, sending them out into the dark in every direction. Ships heard him. Several ships heard him. The Frankfurt heard him. The Burma heard him. The Olympic heard him, the Titanic's sister ship, far away to the south. The Baltic heard him. But none of these were close enough to help in time. The Carpathia heard him. She was 58 miles southeast, and her wireless operator, Harold Cottam, had been about to go to bed when he happened to pick up the Titanic's frequency while still in his headphones. He heard the distress signal. He could not initially believe it was real. He tapped back to confirm. "Come at once," Phillips replied. "We have struck a berg." "It's a CQD, old man." Cottam ran to the bridge. Captain Rostron, who had already been woken by his first officer, heard the position, did the calculation in his head, and turned the ship without a moment of hesitation. He then issued a series of orders that revealed him to be a man of exceptional organizational intelligence. He ordered all hands roused. He ordered the ship's doctors to prepare to receive injured survivors. He ordered the stewards to prepare the dining rooms and public rooms as reception areas for survivors. He ordered the ship's cooks to prepare hot soup and coffee and porridge. He ordered the ship's own lifeboats swung out in their davits, ready for immediate launch if needed. He ordered extra blankets and warm clothing brought up from the stores. He ordered the gangway doors opened. He ordered all unnecessary power diverted to the engines to increase speed. And then he ordered extra lookouts posted all across the bow of the ship, because driving a ship at maximum speed through ice-filled waters in the dark was not something a careful captain did lightly. The Carpathia drove through the night at 17 knots above her rated maximum speed. Her boilers were pushed beyond their designed limits. Cottam stayed at his wireless, maintaining contact with Phillips on the Titanic, relaying information to Captain Rostron, updating the position as Phillips sent it. The contact with the Titanic ended at approximately 2:17 in the morning. This was, within a few minutes, the time the ship actually went under. The wireless stopped. The lights went out on the ocean. The great ship, which had been a city of light against the dark sky, was simply gone. The Carpathia drove on. She reached the field of wreckage and survivors at approximately 4 in the morning. The first lifeboat they found was Boat 2. In it were 4 surviving crew members and 10 surviving passengers. They were hauled aboard the Carpathia one by one. The Carpathia spent the next 4.5 hours collecting survivors from the boats. The last survivor was brought aboard at approximately 8:30 in the morning. The final count was 705 people. Every one of them, when they came aboard, was given something warm to drink. They were wrapped in blankets. They were guided, or carried, to places where they could rest. Then Captain Rostron made a decision. He gathered the surviving officers of the Titanic and asked them whether any other ships were coming, whether there was any realistic hope of more survivors being found. The answer was no. He then led a brief, simple memorial service on the deck of the Carpathia, in the cold morning light, with the wreckage of the Titanic still visible in the water around him. And then he turned his ship toward New York. Part 9, The Carpathia Voyage, 4 days to New York. The voyage from the site of the disaster to New York took 4 days. 4 days on a ship that had not been designed or equipped to carry 700 extra passengers, on top of its own complement of roughly 750. The survivors were accommodated wherever they could be put. First-class passengers from the Titanic were taken in by first-class passengers of the Carpathia, who gave up their cabins. Second-class Titanic survivors were assigned to the Carpathia's second class. Third-class survivors were found space wherever there was space, in the public rooms, in the dining saloons, on mattresses in the corridors. Captain Rostron maintained strict wireless silence for much of the voyage. He did not want the mass of incoming messages from newspapers and officials and anxious relatives clogging the frequency he needed to maintain. He sent only the survivor list, a long, slow transmission, thousands of names, tapped out by the exhausted Harold Cottam over many hours, and then held the frequency largely clear. This decision was well-intentioned, but it had an agonizing effect on the families waiting in New York and across America and Europe. Conflicting and incorrect reports had already been published in the newspapers. The Los Angeles Times, incredibly, published a front page announcing that the Titanic had been struck by an iceberg but all passengers were safe and the ship was being towed to Halifax. This was entirely fabricated, or based on a catastrophically misread wireless message, but it appeared in print and was believed by many people for hours. In New York, families gathered at the White Star Line offices on Lower Broadway, waiting for information that did not come clearly. Wives waited for news of husbands. Parents waited for news of children. The offices were besieged by reporters, by officials, by people who simply stood on the pavement outside and waited because they did not know what else to do. On the Carpathia, the survivors were passing through the first hours and days of a shock they would carry for the rest of their lives. Some of them slept almost immediately, a deep, almost chemical sleep, the body's emergency response to extreme trauma. Others could not sleep at all. Others sat in the dining saloons wrapped in borrowed blankets and stared at the walls, or at the windows, or at each other, not speaking. There were hundreds of women on the Carpathia who did not know whether their husbands were alive. Some waited to see whether a husband's name might appear on the survivor list, hoping it had been missed, hoping there had been a mistake. Most of them already knew, in some part of themselves, what the list would show. But hope has its own weight, its own persistence, and it does not yield to probability easily. The children were both harder and easier than the adults. Harder because their grief was immediate and physical and could not be managed with rationality. Easier because children, given warmth and food and someone to hold them, can sometimes sleep even when the worst has happened. The Carpathia's stewardesses moved among the children like quiet presences, providing what comfort they could. Among the passengers of the Carpathia who gave up their space and their belongings for the survivors was a woman whose name has largely been forgotten by history, a woman named Emily Ryerson, whose own story was not without its tragedy. She had been on the Titanic herself, traveling with her children and servants in first class, returning to America because her son had been killed in an automobile accident. She had been devastated before the disaster and then plunged into a second devastation. Her husband Arthur had seen her and her children into Lifeboat 4 and stayed behind, and had not survived. Emily Ryerson sat on the Carpathia and moved through the days in a state that was beyond simple grief, beyond simple shock. She had been a woman who was already carrying loss when this new loss arrived to compound it. She wrapped herself in silence, spoke little to other survivors, and watched the ocean move past the portholes, hour after hour, as the ship moved south through the ice and then west toward America. She lived until 1939. She never spoke publicly about the Titanic. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoir. Whatever she carried from those 4 days, she kept it. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator, sat in a bunk in the Carpathia's hospital with his frostbitten feet wrapped in bandages and his hands, the hands he needed for his work, shaking badly. Kadam, the Carpathia's wireless operator, was exhausted and could not keep up with the demand for transmissions. Bride, barely able to walk, wrapped himself in borrowed clothes and made his way to the wireless room and sat beside Kadam and helped him for the remaining days of the voyage, sending name after name after name, the slow inventory of the living. He was 22 years old, and he had spent the night clinging to an overturned lifeboat in the North Atlantic, and he went back to work because there was work to be done. Part 10, Arrival in New York. The Carpathia arrived in New York Harbor on the night of Thursday, the 18th of April, 3 days after the Titanic had sunk. The crossing of the harbor was extraordinary. More than 40,000 people lined the piers and the waterfront. Hundreds of boats came out to meet the Carpathia, small craft, tugboats, police launches, and the boats of the newspaper reporters who had been circling all day. The rain had been falling for much of the day, a cold spring rain, and the crowd on the piers was wet and largely silent. There was not the shouting you might expect of a crowd that size. People stood in the rain and watched the ship move past. The Carpathia first stopped at the White Star Line piers and offloaded the Titanic's lifeboats, which she had collected from the water after the rescue. 13 of them. The newspapers photographed them on the pier the next morning, white-painted wooden boats in a row, worn and weathered, stripped of whatever meaning they had once held and reduced to evidence. Then the Carpathia moved to her own pier, Pier 54, at the end of 14th Street, and tied up. The gangplanks were run out, and the survivors came off the ship. The scene at the pier was one that those who witnessed it never forgot. Survivors came down the gangplank in clusters and small groups, some of them strong enough to walk unassisted, some supported by Carpathia crew members or by relatives who had pushed to the front of the crowd, some barely able to stand. Women came down clutching children, or clutching each other, or simply clutching their own arms in the unconscious gesture of someone holding themselves together. The waiting crowd surged forward when the gangplanks opened, and the police struggled to maintain any kind of order. People called out names. Names rang across the wet pier in every direction: first names, family names, the names of people who might or might not be among those coming off the ship, the names of people who were already at the bottom of the North Atlantic. The sound of all those names called out into the rainy New York night was something that reporters who were there tried to describe for their readers, and could not quite capture. Margaret Brown was one of the first survivors to speak to the press. She was, as always, composed and formidable, and she had things to say. She said the disaster had been entirely preventable. She said the warnings about ice had been ignored. She said the inadequacy of the lifeboats was a scandal. She said the class disparity in the survival rates was something that should be examined honestly and without defensiveness. She said all of this while standing on a rainy pier in New York, having spent the previous 4 days on the Carpathia organizing relief for those who had less than her. She said it directly to the reporters who crowded around her, and her words appeared in newspapers the following morning. Other survivors said nothing to anyone. They found relatives or friends at the pier, or they found officials from the White Star Line, or they found nobody at all, and they were taken to hotels or hospitals or apartments, and they went to ground, and they tried to begin the long process of absorbing what had happened. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and one of the most controversial survivors of the disaster, arrived on the Carpathia in a state of near catatonia. He had gotten into collapsible sea as it was being launched from the starboard side, one of the last boats to leave the ship, in circumstances that were and remain disputed. He said there were no women or children visible when he stepped in. Others said he had pushed past people to get a place. The truth is probably that the situation was chaotic enough to accommodate both accounts without either being quite the whole truth. On the Carpathia, Ismay had been given the ship's doctor's cabin, and had barely left it for the entire 4-day voyage. He had eaten almost nothing. He had reportedly been given medication to keep him quiet. When the Carpathia arrived in New York, he was taken off by a side entrance, avoiding the press, and placed in a private house. He resigned from the White Star Line later that year. He retreated to a house in the west of Ireland, in Connaught, on the shore of the Atlantic. He lived there in near isolation for many years, almost never speaking publicly about the Titanic. He died in 1937. His story has never been simple to tell. He was a man who survived when 1,500 people did not. Whether he was a coward or simply a frightened human being in an impossible situation is a question that his contemporaries and history have answered differently in different eras. the Edwardian press largely condemned him. Later generations have been more forgiving. The truth is probably that he was an ordinary man, placed in an extraordinary situation, who made a choice under extreme duress and spent the rest of his life living with it. Part 11: The Inquiries and the Aftermath. In the weeks and months following the disaster, the Titanic was examined from every angle that official inquiry could reach. In the United States, Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan opened a Senate subcommittee inquiry just days after the Carpathia docked. Smith was a passionate, sometimes erratic questioner who knew very little about ships and the sea, and his ignorance occasionally produced exchanges that maritime professionals found exasperating. He famously asked one officer what an iceberg was made of, and received the answer ice with considerable restraint. But his determination to get to the truth, and his willingness to hold powerful people accountable, also produced some remarkable testimony. The inquiry heard from surviving officers, from surviving crew, from passengers of all classes. It heard from Bruce Ismay. It heard from Harold Bride, who gave his testimony with his injured feet wrapped in bandages, sitting in a chair. It examined the design of the ship, the ice warnings, the lifeboat regulations, the speed of the vessel on the night of the collision. Its conclusions were critical of the White Star Line and of Captain Smith. It recommended significant improvements to maritime safety regulations, specifically, mandatory lifeboat space for every person on board a vessel, better wireless communication standards, and the establishment of an ice patrol in the North Atlantic. The British Board of Trade Inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, heard from more than 100 witnesses over 36 days beginning in May 1912. It was, by British standards, a thorough investigation, though critics then and now have suggested that it was also structured in ways that protected the shipping industry from the most damaging conclusions. Lord Mersey's final report exonerated Captain Smith, finding that he had done no more than any competent captain of the era might have done, and laid the disaster primarily at the feet of fate, of conditions that could not reasonably have been anticipated. This conclusion did not satisfy everyone. It satisfied almost no one who had been in the water that night. What the inquiries did produce, in concrete terms, was the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, commonly known as CELAS, which was adopted in 1914. It required that every ship carry enough lifeboat capacity for every person on board. It established the International Ice Patrol, which monitored and reported on iceberg positions in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. It required a continuous wireless watch on passenger vessels. It mandated regular lifeboat drills. These changes saved lives. They saved lives in the years and decades that followed, in ways that can never be fully counted. The Titanic's disaster, in this sense, was not entirely without legacy. For the survivors themselves, the aftermath was long and complex and different for each person. Second Officer Charles Lightoller returned to sea almost immediately. He went back to the White Star Line, which reassigned him to other vessels. He served in the Royal Navy during the First World War, was mentioned in dispatches, and commanded a destroyer. He survived the war. In 1940, at the age of 66, he sailed his private motor yacht, the Sundowner, to the beaches of Dunkirk and helped evacuate more than 100 British soldiers from the beach under fire. He was, by any measure, a man of extraordinary courage. But he never talked about Dunkirk in the way people might have expected, and he never stopped talking about the Titanic. He wrote a memoir, Titanic and Other Ships, that dealt with the disaster with a directness and self-examination unusual for a man of his era. He died in 1952. He was 78 years old. He had been at sea for more than 60 years. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg and rang the bell, had a much harder life. He testified at both inquiries and was treated, at times, as though his failure to spot the berg sooner was a significant cause of the disaster. This, despite the fact that he had no binoculars, had reported the berg as soon as he saw it, and had done everything the training and conditions allowed. He left the sea eventually, worked on land, married, and appeared to find a degree of ordinary life. When his wife died in 1965, he was unable to continue. He died by suicide in January of that year, at the age of 77. There is a bench, now, in Millbrook Square in Southampton, the city from which the Titanic sailed, the city where many of the crew were from, dedicated to Frederick Fleet. It is a simple thing, a bench. But it is there. Eva Hart, the 17-year-old girl who lost her father and survived with her mother in Lifeboat 14, went on to have a long and quietly remarkable life. She became an active opponent of the construction of nuclear power plants, her reasoning being that she had seen what happened when humans were too confident in the infallibility of their technology, when they believed that something they had built could not fail. She testified before government committees on the subject. She wrote. She spoke. She was clear and specific and unsentimental about what she had seen and what she believed it meant. She died in 1996, at 81, a week before a piece of legislation she had supported was defeated. She remained, to the end, the girl in the lifeboat who had heard the sound of the people in the water and had never forgotten it. The third-class survivors, for the most part, are less documented in the historical record. They gave fewer interviews. They wrote fewer memoirs. The papers were less interested in their stories, the stories of immigrants, of the poor, of people without famous names. They arrived in New York with nothing and rebuilt as best they could. Some went on to other ships, other crossings, other attempts at the American dream. Some went back to their countries of origin. Their stories scatter into the ordinary historical record, birth certificates and census forms and naturalization papers, and the quiet, uneventful passage of time. Part 12, The Long Memory. The Titanic sank into the North Atlantic at 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, and she sank into history at almost precisely the same moment, and neither sinking has ever really ended. The ship herself came to rest on the ocean floor in two pieces, the bow section and the stern section, separated by about a third of a mile, lying in approximately 12,500 feet of water. She was not found for 73 years. When Robert Ballard and his team located her in September of 1985, using deep-sea robotic cameras to scan the sea floor, the footage they brought back stopped the world for a moment. There she was. Still there. Encrusted with rust and marine growth, her great anchor chains still hanging in the water ahead of her bow, her grand staircase open to the ocean, her portholes dark. In the debris field between the bow and the stern sections, the cameras found thousands of objects. Shoes, so many shoes, lying on the sediment, in pairs, still paired after 73 years in the deep ocean, because leather decays slowly and the sea had not disturbed their arrangement. Dishes. Bottles. A doll's head. A leather bag. A chamber pot. A clock, its hands stopped. The shoes, many people who saw the footage later said the shoes were what got to them. People talk about the grand staircase, the chandeliers, the sheer scale of what was lost. But the shoes undid them. Because shoes are intimate objects. They hold the shape of a person. They carry the impression of a particular foot, a particular gait, a particular life. And there they were, in pairs, on the ocean floor, in the dark, waiting for feet that would never come back to fill them. The discovery of the wreck reopened the Titanic for a new generation. Books were written. Documentaries were made. James Cameron's 1997 film introduced the ship to hundreds of millions of people who had not been born when the last survivor was still a young person. The film was, in many ways, a fantasy, a love story grafted onto a catastrophe, but it did something important: it restored the humanity of the individual people aboard. It reminded audiences that the numbers 1,517 dead were not a statistic. They were 1,517 people. And the survivors. What did they become over time? What did the experience make of them? They became, each in their own way, carriers of the night. Not in the dramatic, performative sense, though some of them did speak publicly, did lecture, did write, but in the quieter, more private sense. They carried it in the way that very large experiences settle into a person's body and do not leave. They carried it in their sleep. They carried it in the flinch they felt when a ship's horn sounded, or when they saw a film of the ocean, or when someone at a dinner party made a joke about the Titanic and did not know they were in the presence of someone for whom it was not a historical abstraction. Milvina Dean was the last survivor. She died on May 31, 2009, at the age of 97. She had been 9 weeks old when the Titanic sank. She remembered nothing of it, could remember nothing, being an infant. But she had lived its aftermath. Her father, Bertram Dean, had not survived. Her mother, Eddie, had carried her and her brother Bertram Jr. off the ship in a mail bag, a practical improvisation in the dark and the cold, and placed them both in a lifeboat. The family returned to England from America without the father, without the money they had invested in their new life, with nothing except themselves. Milvina Dean grew up not knowing, for many years, that she had been on the Titanic at all. Her mother did not speak of it. It was only when she was 8 years old that she was told. Milvina Dean became, in her old age, something of a public presence in the Titanic world. She attended conventions and exhibitions. She signed photographs and shook hands and answered questions from people who wanted to touch, however briefly, the living history she carried in her person. She was cheerful and matter-of-fact about it. She said she didn't mind being asked. She said she was glad people still cared. When she died in 2009, her ashes were scattered off the dock at Southampton, where the Titanic had departed 97 years before. The circle closed quietly, on a spring day, by the water. There are other stories in the long memory, stories of the survivors' stories, the way the accounts were passed down through families, changed in the telling, kept alive by grandchildren who were told the same scene over and over at bedtime or at holiday dinners, until the scene became something like myth without becoming any less true. A woman in Minnesota whose grandmother had been in Lifeboat 6, who grew up hearing about the cold of the water and the sound of the band, and who kept a small photograph of the ship on her dresser her entire life without ever quite being able to say why she found it comforting. A man in Southampton whose grandfather had been a stoker on the ship and had not survived, whose family had received the telegram, the barest official language, the minimum of words, and had folded the telegram into a book and kept the book on a shelf, and the book had passed from hand to hand through 3 generations until the paper was soft and creased and almost illegible. The families of the lost. They are part of this story too. The disaster did not end when the Carpathia reached New York. It continued to unspool through years and decades, through marriages and children born and lives built in the shadow of absence, in the particular silence that surrounds things too large and too painful to speak about directly. In Southampton, which provided a disproportionate number of the Titanic's crew, the stewards, the stokers, the engineers, the officers, the grief was concentrated in particular streets, particular terraced rows, where multiple families had lost men on the same night. There were streets in Southampton where almost every house was in mourning. The White Star Line sent representatives to deliver the bad news door to door. Some of those representatives, young men, and used to this work, given a list of names and addresses and told to go and knock, later said it was the worst thing they had ever done, walking down those streets in the April gray, watching the doors open, watching the faces of the women who opened them, watching the understanding arrive. The crew who survived returned to those streets and found that survival had its own complications. They were grateful, how could they not be grateful, but gratitude coexisted uneasily with the knowledge of who had not made it. Some of them found that their neighbors, their friends, the families of men who had died, could not quite look at them the same way. Some of them found jobs on other ships. Some could not go back to sea. There is a memorial in Southampton, a tall red sandstone monument erected in 1914, listing the names of the engineers who died on the Titanic. All 25 engineers died. Every single one of them, to the last man. They stayed at their posts in the engine room, keeping the pumps running and the lights on, knowing that the water was coming and that they had no path out. The lights on the Titanic stayed on until almost the very end, and that is because those 25 men chose to stay. Their names are listed on the monument in alphabetical order, without rank or distinction. They are all equal there, in stone, in Southampton, in the memory of the city. There is, too, a particular silence around the musicians. Their story has been told many times, the men who played while the ship sank, and in that telling there is sometimes a quality of romance, of heroism rendered noble by the music. And it was heroic. It was extraordinary. But it is also worth sitting with the fact that they were young men, most of them very young, some barely out of boyhood, and they played not because they were indifferent to death, but perhaps because they were terrified of it, and music was the thing they knew how to do with their hands and their breath and their concentrated attention. It was the thing they had to offer. And so they offered it. The last piece of music they played has been debated for a century. Several survivors said it was nearer, my God, to thee. Others disputed this. Some said it was an Episcopal hymn called Autumn. Some said it was simply a ragtime tune whose name they could not recall. The musicians themselves are not available to clarify, and the debate has a quality of earnest human confusion that is itself entirely fitting. People, in the worst moments, do not always track the fine details. They remember the feeling, the sound, the presence of something beautiful in the middle of something terrible. The exact title of the song is almost beside the point. What matters is that there was music. And then there was not. There are specific objects that have survived from the Titanic, objects that have their own stories, their own weight of memory and meaning. The ship's wheel is gone, buried in the wreck. But there are other things. There is a menu from the first-class dining room for April 14, 1912, the final dinner, the last meal, 10 courses of elaborate Edwardian cuisine, oysters and consommé and poached salmon and filet mignon and Waldorf pudding and French ice cream, all of it consumed in the white-paneled dining saloon while the ship moved at 22 knots toward the ice. Someone kept the menu, or rather someone rescued it, carried it off the ship in a pocket or a bag, and it survived and is now held in a museum, the ink slightly faded, the paper soft with age, a document of the last ordinary evening before everything changed. There are life jackets recovered from the bodies of the dead. The bodies were collected from the ocean in the days after the disaster by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, which was sent from Halifax, Nova Scotia, with embalming supplies and hundreds of coffins. Her crew recovered 340 bodies from the North Atlantic, in a process that took 10 days, and that was, by all accounts, one of the most psychologically devastating tasks that any group of men was ever asked to perform professionally. Many of the bodies they found were in good physical condition. Hypothermia kills quickly but gently. The people they found in the water looked, for the most part, as though they were sleeping. The Mackay Bennett's crew documented each body as best they could: clothing, jewelry, personal items found in pockets, physical descriptions. They worked with great care and with considerable humanity, given the circumstances. They buried 116 bodies at sea, those who could not be preserved or identified. They brought the rest to Halifax. Among the bodies they recovered was that of a young child, a boy, approximately 19 months old, blonde-haired, unknown, dressed in good clothes, unidentified. He was buried in Halifax at a cemetery called Fairview Lawn. His grave marker read simply, "Our Babe." For 90 years, no one knew who he was. In 2002, DNA analysis identified him as Aino Viljami Panula, a Finnish child traveling in third class with his mother and 4 brothers. All 5 died. But a subsequent DNA analysis in 2007 identified him instead as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, an English child of similar age, also traveling in third class, also lost with his entire family. The uncertainty is itself part of the story. The loss was so large, so complete, that even a century of science and research cannot always put the right name on the right face. There are families who will never know exactly what happened to the person they lost. There are graves that may hold the wrong name. There are questions that the ocean has closed over and will not reopen. And yet the Titanic story persists. It persists because it contains within it almost every element of human experience that matters: hope and hubris, class and courage, love and loss, chance and choice. It persists because it happened at a particular fulcrum of history, the last years of one world before the first great catastrophe of the next century began, and because it captured in miniature something that the broader century would demonstrate on a massive scale: that the things human beings build are always, in the end, subject to the conditions they cannot fully anticipate or control. It persists, too, because of the survivors. Because they came home. Because they spoke, or chose not to speak. Because they rebuilt their lives or failed to rebuild them, married or did not marry, had children or did not, worked or suffered or flourished in the particular ways that human beings work and suffer and flourish. Because they were ordinary people to whom an extraordinary thing had happened, and who then had to go on being ordinary people for the rest of their ordinary years, carrying the extraordinary thing with them like a stone in a pocket, always there, always felt, sometimes forgotten for hours or days at a time, but always there. There is a quality of the night of April 14, 1912, that resists being finished. The story wants to continue. The names want to be said again. The cold wants to be felt again, the dark, the still ocean, the stars overhead, the lights of the ship going down. And so we say the names. We keep the cold in mind. We hold the night gently, carefully, the way you hold something that is very old and very fragile and very precious. Eva Hart, Lawrence Beasley, Margaret Brown, Harold Bride, Milvina Dean, Charlotte Collier, Edith Russell, Michelle Navratil, Frederick Fleet, Charles Lightoller, Arthur Rostron, Wallace Hartley, John Hume, Roger Bricoux, and 1,500 more whose names the ocean keeps. The stars above the North Atlantic that night were extraordinary. Sailors who were on ships nearby later commented on it. There was no moon. The sky was absolutely clear. And in the absence of any light from the land, in those early April hours before dawn, the stars were so numerous and so bright that they reflected in the perfectly still sea, so that the ocean and the sky were continuous with each other, one great field of light and dark, with no clear horizon between them. Frederick Fleet, in The Crow's Nest, had those stars. He had the cold, and the dark, and those stars, and nothing between him and the iceberg but his own 2 eyes. The people in the lifeboats had those stars. They had the cold, and each other, and the weight of what they had seen, and the cold beauty of the stars reflecting in the black water all around them, above and below, in every direction, the whole universe of stars. And somewhere beneath those stars, somewhere in the 12,000 feet of still dark water below, the ship rested. Rest still. The shoes still paired on the sediment. The clock still stopped. The grand staircase opened to the deep cold sea, and fish moving through it in the dark, unhurried and silent, indifferent and exquisite. Closing meditation. Let your breathing slow now. Let the story settle into you like sediments settling in still water. Gently. Without force. Finding their own resting place. The people we have traveled with tonight, they made it through. They came home. They sat at tables and held cups of tea in their hands and felt the warmth of ordinary life resume around them, and they were grateful for it, even when they were sad, even when they were changed. That is what survival is. Not the absence of grief, but the continuation of life alongside it. The ability of the human person to hold very large things in a very small body, and to keep going anyway. Your own body is holding you right now. Feel that. Feel the surface beneath you, the warmth around you, the quiet of the room, the simple extraordinary fact of being here, breathing, safe, still. The North Atlantic is far away tonight. The cold is far away. The dark ocean is far away. You are here. You are warm. You are safe. Let the image of the stars come gently to you, the stars above the still ocean, the stars reflected below, the whole quiet universe holding itself in place around a small wooden lifeboat, around the people in it, keeping them in light even in the deepest dark. Let those stars carry you now. Down through the soft layers of rest. Down through the gentle dark that is nothing like the dark of that April night. This dark is warm, this dark is yours, this dark is the dark of sleep and restoration and the body's deep wisdom returning to itself. Let the names of the survivors be the last thing you hear, moving through you like a quiet current. Eva. Lawrence. Margaret. Harold. Milvina. Charlotte. Edith. Michelle. Frederick. Charles. Arthur. Wallace. And all the ones who came home and did not leave their names behind, who lived and worked and loved and were forgotten by history and remembered by their families. All of them carried the night. All of them put it down, eventually, in sleep, in the dark, and let their bodies rest. You can do that too. Right now. Tonight. Let everything go. The water is still. The stars are there. You are safe. Sleep now. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.